and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris, and you're watching The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. I'm delighted to introduce my guest tonight. Her name is Nisha Sabanayagam. She is the Program and Operations Manager at the NGO Action Society, or better known as AWAM. Nisha, welcome to the show. So good to have you here with us.
Hi, thank you, Melissa. Happy to be here.
We're not here together separately, of course, working from home. It's the new normal with these virtual interviews, but it's good to see you and to chat to you tonight. And I wanted to begin our conversation a little bit with a look at AWAM's work, because I feel like I've heard and known about AWAM for many, many years. Every time I think about women's rights and women's rights advocacy and anything to do with promoting gender equality in Malaysia, I think of AWAM, which is a good thing. But for those who are not so familiar with the work that AWAM does, maybe you can start by sharing a little bit about AWAM's background, the work that you guys are doing, and what it is that you're advocating for, what you want to see achieved in Malaysia.
So what we focus on over the years is basically eradicating gender-based violence. So, domestic violence, sexual harassment, rape, those kind of issues. Currently, we're part of the National Domestic Violence Task Force. We were part of the group of stakeholders, women's groups as well as other groups that formulated the current sexual harassment draft. The current one. And interesting point, the current draft was based off a draft 20 years ago that AWAM and Women's Centers for Change in Penang actually formulated.
There's been some setbacks in tabling that bill. I'm very curious about the bill, and I wanted to talk to you about this sexual harassment bill. So let's kind of pivot the conversation and discuss this bill. What is actually in this bill? I'm quite curious to know. You said it's based on a draft 20 years ago. Times have changed in the past 2 decades. So what does this bill contain, which hopefully covers all different definitions of sexual harassment? I take it you've worked on the bill. What can we expect when we finally see it tabled? Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Okay. Really good question, really important question, and everybody needs to know this. So the Sexual Harassment Bill actually gives you a more comprehensive and better definition of what is sexual harassment. In Malaysia, the current laws don't really give you a proper definition, which is in itself quite lacking. So with the Sexual Harassment Bill, what we define sexual harassment as is when a person who is on the receiving act of a sexual nature feels offended, harassed, threatened, or humiliated, that can constitute as sexual harassment. So if you notice my definition, what I'm saying that's quite pertinent here is that we're looking at the perception and the emotions and the feelings of the person who is actually on the receiving end of the act. And it's any act of a sexual nature. So that word sexual is also really important. So this takes out just normal, like for example, harassment or bullying. It's purely sexual harassment. And so that's what makes it quite different, because sexual harassment can be so subjective, right? What can be sexual harassment to me may not be sexual harassment to you. What can be sexual harassment to you may not be sexual harassment to me. I mean, imagine somebody from, say, a very strong religious background, like, a Hindu person or a Muslim girl, for example, right? Living in a smaller area. And some guy comes up to her and, maybe just even, unknowingly or maybe knowingly, just puts his hand on her arm and just starts rubbing her, or, just taps her a little bit, not even on her butt, maybe on her hip, for example, just taps her on her hip. For her, that could be really huge, right? But for maybe you and me, somebody who comes up to us and just taps us on the butt, and we just like, we'll probably just tell the person off, or we'll just give them a really dirty look and we'll walk off, and it'll never bother us again. But for her, it could be something that really bothers her because of her background, because of her exposure, right? And for her, if there was a sexual harassment act and she decides to bring that particular scenario and bring that guy to court, she would be able to actually have a case, because in her opinion, this person came and touched her without her consent, and it made her feel really bothered, and she felt that it was a touch of a sexual nature because he touched her on her hip, or he touched her on her body, which normally she does not allow people to touch. The sexual harassment also allows for a tribunal, as opposed to you having to go to the police or going to the court. So what's really important here, and this is really good, is that it allows for easy access to justice. It allows for low cost. You don't need to hire a lawyer. That's one of the reasons why people also don't report, because the cost of it and the process is so difficult. You know, you have to go to the police first. Sometimes you might have to go to the doctor first. And the tribunal is supposed to be manned not just by legal people who obviously have a good, strong legal background and are able to be judges, but also people who have a very good, strong knowledge, a very good technical knowledge about sexual harassment. And that's really important, because so somebody from a women's group, for example, could be part of the tribunal. And because, you know, because we are so used and so aware of the issue of sexual harassment, when somebody comes up to me and tells me that they've been sexually harassed, I would immediately know how this person is feeling, how to react to this person. I would immediately not even question whether is that sexual harassment or not, because I would know, right? Whereas a legal person would probably say, okay, well, we have certain definitions of what is sexual harassment, kind of thing. So the tribunal also has that balance of enough personalities and people with enough with diverse backgrounds, so that we can actually look at the situation really fairly.
But Nisha, I like that you said that, you know, that just a simple question: is this really sexual harassment or not? And I know you gave an example of someone touching a hip or a body part without consent. Does it necessarily need to be physical? Does physical touch need to come into play? I mean, I know sexual harassment can also be verbal, but in this day and age where we're kind of glued to our phones and social media, can you be harassed technologically? Can you be sexually harassed that way?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because yes, online sexual harassment is becoming a huge issue. So yes, so sexual harassment comes in various different forms. We have obviously the physical, very obvious one. We have verbal, also quite obvious. We have something that we call as online sexual harassment, what you get over your phones, what you get over over Facebook, over Twitter. And then we also have what we call psychological sexual harassment, where a person, you know, says something to you and then, you know, makes sure that you feel a little bit uncomfortable and then goes away, or says something to you on the side without people ever really being aware of it, and, you know, is actually, you know, literally trying to make you feel offended and harassed and humiliated. And what's really interesting in psychological sexual harassment, or even other forms of sexual harassment, is that person doesn't necessarily have to have a sexual interest in you. So the basis of sexual harassment is really, it's really power play, right? Right? You're right. I mean, I could sexually harass you now. I could be. I'm totally uninterested in you physically or.
It's the power dynamic, right? It's about a way of asserting power or authority over someone else, making them feel demeaned.
And that's what people need to understand. So that's why it's quite difficult sometimes, I think, for also women to bring up cases, or even men for that matter, actually with men, to bring up cases of being sexually harassed, because they'd be like, oh, come on, you know, there's no way this person's going to harass you. You know, you're not pretty enough, or you're not good looking enough, you're not interesting enough. But actually, it's not about having a sexual interest. It's really about the power dynamics at the end of the day.
Okay. I mean, we're essentially now getting into what constitutes sexual harassment. So I want to come back to the bill. So the bill actually covers this in a comprehensive way. Are you do you worry that the bill might have gaps or areas that it hasn't sufficiently covered?
Well, so as you know, we've been working on the bill for 20 years, right?
That's a long time to be working on a bill.
Taking into consideration the changes over the years, and every time a new minister comes into the Ministry of Women, so the Sexual Harassment Act, if it ever comes about, is under the purview of the Ministry of Women. So every time a new minister came about, every time we have a election and a new minister, the women's group would always bring it up to the minister. And basically, it was just a matter of whether the minister was interested enough to actually push the bill forward.
Right.
So to give credit where credit is due, the Pakatan Harapan government, so the Ministry of Women under YB Wan Aziza and YB Hanayo, they actually literally had the commitment and the political will to push it forward, right? And like I said, so in terms of your question, whether there are gaps or not, right? It's been 20 years in the making. And in the last couple of years, while Pakatan Harapan was still in government and while they had this promise that they wanted to have the sexual harassment bill tabled at least by 2019 or 2020, there was a lot of engagement between the women's groups and the ministry. And what the ministry did, which was really excellent as well, was they involved a bunch of stakeholders who were not necessarily from women's groups. So we had people from JAKIM, we had people from JAIS, we had people from Suhakam, we had people from, I believe, even representing like, you know, the youth and sports ministry, the education ministry. Yeah, because it needs to be comprehensive, right? You don't want to make a mistake with it, right? We are pushing forward quite an important bill, and sexual harassment happens everywhere, right? So this bill took into consideration the fact that sexual harassment happens in public places, it happens in schools, it happens in universities, it happens in organizations. So how do we ensure that we have enough legislation that provides protection for both women and men? So it's not just the women, it's women and men, and basically Malaysians, non-Malaysians, everybody. How do we ensure that everybody is safe from sexual harassment in Malaysia? So there was a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings, and what was really, really fantastic, and I really salute the ministry for doing this, was they brought in sexual harassment laws in other countries for us to sort of like learn from. Yes. So we were put in a hotel for 3 days, all the stakeholders, together with the ministry's agencies. We were basically stuck in this hotel for 3 days. And from like 9 to the last 2 days, we were working from 9 to 11, going through samples of acts from different countries. We looked at the Sexual Harassment Act in Pakistan, in Australia, in India, in the UK, various other countries. Because we were trying to see okay, so they have something here. Do you think Malaysia should have something like this? So very comprehensive, you know.
That's really wonderful. So we're taking the opportunity to learn from what works in other countries and adapt it to Malaysia. Okay, Nisha, we're going to take a quick break, but let's come back. There's so much to cover and half the show has gone already. So we're going to come back and talk more about the sexual harassment bill. Stay tuned to The Future's Female. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to The Future's Female. I'm Melisa Idris and I'm speaking to Nisha Sabanayagam from the women's rights organization AWAM. So we've been talking about the sexual harassment bill, which was expected to be tabled last year, but has been pushed back for many reasons. Now, I'm hoping to see it be tabled this year. Nisha, I want to talk to you a little bit because we were talking about the what constitutes harassment. And one of the things that you said that really lingered with me was that this bill has been drafted to really take into to put front and center the woman's perception of what sexual harassment is. So whether she perceives herself to have been harassed is really sexually harassed is really important. And you also mentioned that this bill is 20 years in the making. I wanted to ask you how that definition has perhaps evolved, because there's been things that we now consider to be sexual harassment that maybe 10, 20 years ago were brushed off, or we kind of learned to live with those harassments as women and men. So how do you teach people, and I know this is part of AWAM's work, that's not just policy advocacy but also training and public awareness, how do you teach people to understand that what they've experienced can be sexual harassment, to unlearn certain behaviors that perhaps previously were accepted, now no longer accepted, and to to unlearn those behaviors, basically. What goes into that conversation, that very difficult conversation about teaching someone about sexual harassment?
Okay, you asked some really tough questions, but that's a good one.
Sorry, I know it's a difficult
No, but that's a really good one. I like the way you put it, because now it's also making me think about how did we actually come up with this particular definition. And I think it's actually been understanding that over the years, we've had women who've actually tried to use the current laws and go to and try to get justice. But because the current laws definitions were so limited and so small in scope, that it was really difficult for them to actually get justice. Even in the penal code, right? There actually really needs to be a very, very high burden of proof. So you really need to show that you have been sexually harassed. And when the sexual harassment is verbal or psychological, for example, right? And you're the only one on the receiving end, right? So it's going to be really hard for you to be able to use the definition in the penal code to prove that you've been sexually harassed. Although I've spoken to a few lawyers recently, and lawyers are now also starting to pay a lot of attention to the women's emotions and feelings. But within the law, it's still very clear that you have to have a really clear-cut example and proof and perhaps even physical evidence that you've been sexually harassed. So as we receive, and one of the things that AWAM does is that we also receive people who come to us and need advice, legal advice, or they need counseling for their gender-based violence acts that have happened to them. And as we talk to more and more survivors coming to us, and they tell us about their issues as to why they don't want to report about it, or why they've tried to report about it and it's been unsuccessful, whether it's within their workplace or whether they go to the police or whether they immediately try to get a lawyer to support them in the process. We learned that it's simply because sometimes it's very difficult to have tangible proof. So the sexual harassment law, the sexual harassment bill was actually sort of devised based of all this real life evidence of cases of women and men coming to us and telling them about what they've experienced. So that's a great way to actually draft out a bill, don't you think? That to actually really get the experiences of the people who've actually gone through the process, right?
It's acknowledging the lived experiences, but also taking into the feedback. And this law feels really, it feels alive. It feels like it's changing and living in this current time, which is very important. Is there anyone you suspect might push back against this bill? I'm wondering whether this bill might get any resistance, and it may not even be knowingly resistance, but I'm wondering whether people might feel like this bill might be too much, might be too, there might be people who come back. We've seen this with the Me Too campaign, the Me Too movement, that there was pushback and there was backlash. And
yes.
Are you concerned that there might be resistance to this law, to this bill?
Okay, so a lot of people don't realize this, but even when we were under the Barisan National government, they actually had a commitment in their manifesto to pass the sexual harassment bill.
Oh wow! I didn't know that.
Yeah. That's why it's so important to have leaders that actually have the political will to push this through. So I guess during the Barisan National Government with the women's ministries, they were really more focused on other aspects. The resources were not really focused on making sure that this bill went through. So when the Pakatan Harapan government came through, obviously they also had it in their manifesto. And I think with the Pakatan Harapan government, they made it really clear that this was something that they wanted to do, and they tried to live up to that promise. So in terms of pushback, or especially from the viewpoint of the government, we really don't. And even when we tried to introduce it and tried to get the bill passed in 2020, we really did not expect, we do not and did not expect any pushback, and that there is none.
Okay. I'm going to ask a really frank question. We know sexual harassment affects men as well as women, but to a larger degree, women. Are you concerned that this sexual harassment bill might get pushback from men who might be concerned that they will be at the receiving end of, suits or criminal action against perhaps some of their behaviors in the past.
Okay, so if you notice when I said what I said just now, I said the government's okay with it.
I noticed.
Yes, yes, we have had pushback from the general public. We do get men coming to us and telling us things like, "Oh, does that mean that I can't even ask somebody out for a date now because that's going to be considered sexual harassment?" And it's not about your personal particular action against a woman. If she's unhappy with it and she tells you that she's unhappy with it, then you just have to basically stop doing it, right? It's all about respecting the individual that's next to you or in front of you, whether it's a man or a woman. What a lot of men who come to us and tell us these things, the ones who come and tell us, I'm just making a joke about the girl, I'm never going to do that. Yes, you as an individual, you may not be doing it. It's for you, it's purely a joke. It will never translate into reality. But the fact that you are normalizing it and you're openly normalizing it, you don't realize that there are other people who don't have the same mindset as you. So another guy who may not be as enlightened or as exposed as you, he might see this as, oh, okay, that guy says it's okay, and that guy's pretty cool, so I guess I can do it too. And this person might actually take what you see as a joke and translate it into reality. So that's how we try to educate men who come back to us with this pushback. You may never in your life ever sexually harass a woman, but that does not mean that we should not be telling people that it's wrong to do it.
I have to admit, I'm very encouraged by the younger generation. Far more open to learning, boundaries, yes, and yes, respectful consent, behavior to different sexes, and unlearning what they may have been taught in the past. I'm wondering, this is me genuinely asking a question of whether sexual harassing behavior, particularly in older men, and I'm generalizing here, can that be unlearned? Because that's the one we want to tackle, so that men of a certain age in certain positions of power are not using their resources and influence to sexually harass younger men and women, and not teach young men toxic masculinity. Is that the target audience that you're focusing? Can that generation of men, their mindsets be changed?
So that they are definitely part of the target audience that we're focusing. We're obviously focusing these messaging to everybody, right? Because what we want is a society that practices zero tolerance to sexual harassment. And that's a really good example that you brought up, because yes, that particular stakeholder group would be one of the most difficult groups for us to actually try to be able to change their mindset. It's going to be really, really difficult. So that's why it's really important to have legislation, because at the end of the day, right, if I can't, if not, okay, not me, but if women's groups or any other CSOs or even the media, people like you, who try to support the movement, if we can't do anything as a society to change their mindset, then something that's stronger needs to be brought forward, and that's why legislation is so important. And with the new Sexual Harassment Bill, the bill is very clear that it would require all organizations, whether formal or informal, to have a sexual harassment policy that is effective and workable within their organizations. Yes. And on top of that,
so you're saying that organizations need to show that they've made an effort to have some kind of sexual harassment policy, to have this type of training, in an structured corporate setting. Oh, that's very interesting.
Yes, and what's even more interesting is, so a lot of organizations do have that. They do tick that box, right? but whether they actually implement the policy correctly is a wholly different matter, right? So the additional clauses in the bill that will allow you as an employee to be able to come to the tribunal if you find that your employer may have this policy but is actually not implementing it properly. So you can actually take your employer to the tribunal, which is fantastic. Don't you think so?
I think so. Nisha, we've actually run out of time, but there is still so much more to cover when it comes to talking about sexual harassment and the necessary legislation needed to achieve justice for survivors. I still wanted to talk about men as allies and how to support survivors of sexual harassment. It looks like I might have to have you back on the show to discuss this a little bit more. But thank you so much for all the good work that AWAM is doing to ensure that this bill will see the light of day. Keeping our fingers crossed that it will happen sooner rather than later. Nisha, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such an education talking to you this evening. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of The Future's Female. I will be back with you same time next week. I'll catch you then. Thank you so much for watching and good night.